Think about practically every action movie you've ever watched or, every first-person shooter game you've ever played. The hero dramatically kicks open a door, fires a shotgun from the hip with one hand, and sends the villain flying backward 20 feet across the room. It looks visually absolutely incredible, right? But I want you to stop and ask yourself, how many of those Hollywood shotgun scenes do you actually believe? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are taking everything you've passively absorbed from cinema and video games, and we're going to put it to the ultimate test. We're looking at shattering shotgun myths, physics, tactics, and reality. Digging into this source material is super fascinating because it allows us to break down these really pervasive Hollywood illusions together, using hard data, structural mechanics, and proven physics. No movie magic here, folks, just the uncompromising truth of how these tools actually function in the real world. All right, let's set the stage. We are pitting the ultimate showdown, the movie hero versus the unrelenting laws of physics. In the movies, shotguns basically operate like magic wands. You've got targets flying backward, one-handed firing without a second thought, and absolutely no aiming required to clear a room. But the laws of physics? Well, they bring Newton's third law, brutal recoil forces, and a surprisingly tight projectile spread to the equation. We're going to pit these cinematic expectations directly against real-world physics. Starting right off with Section 1, Hollywood Physics Fails, Debunking the Movie Magic. Get this number in your head. 20,000. That is the actual amount of foot-pounds of energy you would mathematically need to launch an average human being backward through the air. Now let's ground that in reality for a second. A standard 12-gauge shotgun only generates about 2,000 to 3,000 foot-pounds. Heck, even if you step all the way up to a military 50 BMG, which is the most powerful rifle in the US arsenal, that still only hits about 15,000 foot-pounds. So launching someone across a room, it literally falls tremendously short of the threshold required. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the core problem, Newton's third law. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. To actually launch a person, the action hero would basically need to pull the trigger on an aircraft-mounted GAU-8 Avenger cannon, which happens to be roughly the size of a car. Because of Newton's third law, the force that pushes the projectile forward is the exact same force pushing the gun backward. So, if a standard gun could launch the target, it would instantaneously launch the shooter backward right alongside them. Now, what's really interesting is the reality of the recoil energy we actually do experience. A 12-gauge generates roughly 20 to 40 foot-pounds of recoil. To wrap your head around that, imagine dropping a 10-pound weight from about 2 to 4 feet straight down onto your shoulder. That sudden, sharp impact, that's exactly what shotgun recoil feels like. And this perfectly proves why firing one-handed like a movie star is physically impossible. The gun would either fly right out of your hand or smash directly into your face. But on the flip side, it also proves that despite the myths, if you have the shotgun properly braced against your shoulder, that 40 foot-pounds of force will absolutely not dislocate it. Moving on to Section 2, the aiming and range illusion. Let's tackle this whole point-and-click myth. There's this massive misconception that pellets scatter into a giant cloud the exact millisecond they leave the barrel. Well, they don't. And the reason why is all thanks to the plastic shot cup. This is a small sleeve inside modern shells that holds all the individual pellets together as a single tight unit. They fly as one solid cluster until aerodynamic drag eventually pulls that cup away. And depending on the load, that separation might not even begin until 20 yards downrange. So the crucial point here is this. Shotgun spread is only about 1 single inch per yard of distance. That means at 10 yards, which, let's be honest, is practically the other side of a very large room, the spread is just a fist-sized cluster. It is not some magical wall of lead covering the entire hallway. At the close defensive ranges we usually see in real-world scenarios, the spread is practically negligible. So yeah, you absolutely undeniably still have to aim. And hey, let's address that other myth, that shotguns are completely useless at long range. Performance completely depends on the ammunition you use. Buckshot is reliably effective out to about 25 to 50 yards. But if you switch to a Foster slug, you extend that effective range right out to 75 yards. And if you pop in a Sabot slug, you suddenly have long-range accuracy well past 100 yards. Hunters have successfully used these specific ammo types for generations to take down game at medium distances. It's a highly versatile tool, definitely not just a short-range toy. All right, that brings us to Section 3, Terrible Home Defense Advice. Time to look at some dangerous movie tactics. I know you've heard this one constantly. Just rack the shotgun in the dark. That sound will scare anyone away. Here is exactly why relying on a sound effect is a terrible tactical decision. First of all, it immediately gives up your physical position in the dark. Second, if your weapon was already loaded, well, you just ejected a live, vital shell right onto the floor. And third, it assumes an intruder, someone who has already made the highly irrational decision to break into an occupied home, is suddenly going to have a highly rational fear response to a clicking noise. Then, of course, there's the classic Hollywood move of stepping out onto the porch and firing a warning shot into the sky. The tactical reality here is pretty grim. Firing into the air wastes limited vital ammunition, literally burning a round you might desperately need 30 seconds later. Furthermore, it's highly illegal in many places and can easily lead to your arrest even if no one is harmed. But most importantly, warning shots don't neutralize threats, they often just communicate to an armed person that they should start shooting back, quickly escalating a tense standoff into a devastating gunfight. And let's see how this builds right into our next cinematic tactic, the old rock salt load. The Hollywood tactic tells you to load rock salt to scare intruders away with a painful, non-lethal sting. But consider the tactical reality for a second. Rock salt is incredibly low density. It decelerates almost instantly once it leaves the barrel, doing absolutely nothing but angering an armed assailant if they're more than 12 feet away. In a true life-or-death defensive situation, intentionally trying to wound someone with an impractical novelty round might just buy them the exact amount of time they need to kill you. Finally, Section 4, the perfect weapon myth. Because bigger definitely isn't always better. It's incredibly easy to fall into the trap of thinking bigger shell, more power, better results. But the reality is that Magnum recoil completely ruins follow-up shots. When you step up to massive 3.5-inch Magnum shells, the extreme kick pushes your body entirely out of position. The muzzle rises, your stance breaks. It's a mess. A shooter running standard shells and staying accurate through multiple shots will almost always outperform someone who's just getting physically thrown around by their own Magnum loads. More power simply does not equal better performance if you can't control it. People also constantly suggest shotguns as the ultimate beginner firearm because, hey, they seem pretty simple. But consider the reality. Most shotguns only hold 1 to 8 shells, and reloading them one by one under high stress is incredibly slow. When you combine that extremely low ammunition capacity with heavy weapon weight and brutal recoil, you quickly realize shotguns are actually quite difficult for true beginners. They demand serious, ingrained muscle memory to operate effectively. And speaking of mechanics, what about the myth that pump-action shotguns literally never fail? Let's break down a few common issues that prove otherwise. First, the short stroke. This is purely human error where a stressed user doesn't pull the pump handle all the way back, causing a jam. Then there's ejection failure, which is often caused by low-quality steel-cased ammo expanding too much and gripping the chamber walls. And finally, a double feed. That's a mechanical failure where worn internal shell stops release 2 shells at once. So yes, pump actions are very reliable, but they are absolutely not immune to mechanical or human failure. So what do you actually do when a jam, like a classic stovepipe, does happen? Step 1. Do not throw the gun away in frustration like a movie hero out of ammo. Step 2. Clear the spent shell manually. With proper training, this really only takes a few seconds. Step 3. Retain the weapon. Throwing away a jammed gun needlessly gives up a heavy tool that could still save your life as a defensive striking object. Unless you are actively drowning or formally surrendering, you hold on to that tool. We also really need to shatter the one shot equals an instant drop myth. To put it very plainly, the human body is not an on-off switch. Unless a projectile directly disrupts the brain or the upper spinal cord, immediate incapacitation is never guaranteed, even with something as powerful as a shotgun. Accurate hits may cause lethal blood loss, sure, but that process takes time, and in the meantime, the target can absolutely still react, move, and pose a serious threat to you. So, I want you to think about this. What in the world connects a modern shotgun, a dusty piece of 19th century British law, and a Japanese toy? I mean, at first glance, there's literally no connection, right? You've got a functional tool for hunting, some incredibly old legislation written for public security, and an item built just for play and collection. But, as we'll see today, these 3 wildly different things are actually bound tightly together. They all share the exact same mechanical principles, and honestly, a total obsession with controlling explosive pressure.
To unravel this whole mystery, we're going to trace a complete mechanical journey. We'll start with the anatomy of a firearm, look at how it's tested to the absolute breaking point, and then finish up with how it is safely and flawlessly simulated.
Okay, let's dive into this by looking at the tangible, physical anatomy of a shotgun. Now, even if you know this stuff inside and out, it's really helpful to establish the baseline mechanics. We can break it down into 4 core pieces. You've got the stock. That's the foundation you grip and press into your shoulder to handle the recoil. Then there's the action. This is the beating heart of the whole machine, right? It loads, fires, and ejects the shells. From there, the explosive energy travels down the barrel, which is really just the tube guiding the projectile, until it finally exits at the muzzle. Every single variation of a firearm you'll ever see builds straight off these basic functional blocks.
Now that action we just mentioned, it fundamentally defines what the tool actually is. Let's look at 2 classic examples. A pump action relies on a manual sliding forend. You pull it back to eject the spent shell, push it forward to chamber a fresh one, and boom, you get that iconic sound. Contrast that with a brake action. This one is just remarkably simple and elegant. The entire firearm essentially pivots open on a sturdy steel hinge pen so you can manually load the chamber. But here's the key takeaway for us. In both of these designs, we are dealing with the highly controlled containment of a literal explosion. And early societies quickly realized that containing those explosions was, well, incredibly dangerous if it wasn't strictly regulated. What you're looking at here is the crest of the Gun Makers Company of London. This was established by an Act of Parliament way back in 1813 specifically for public security. Because think about it. A firearm is containing a violent explosion right next to the user's face. The materials and the construction had to be absolutely flawless. This sparked a deep historical tradition of independent testing, making it an absolute requirement to guarantee a barrel wouldn't just burst the second you pulled the trigger.
Along with London, we also have the Birmingham Proof House, which has its own pretty elaborate crest right here. Through a series of super strict regulations, specifically the Gun Barrel Proof Acts of 1868, 1950, and 1978, the UK established this rigorous mandate. You couldn't just build a barrel in your workshop and go sell it. No way. It had to be officially proved. These laws dictated impartially that absolutely every single barrel, whether it was smoothbore or rifled, had to undergo severe, structured testing before it could legally get into a user's hands.
So, what does this brutal proofing procedure actually look like in practice? Well, it's a 3-step process. First up is the view. This is a meticulous pre-inspection where they measure the exact bore and chamber dimensions to make sure they meet strict baseline standards. Second, they fire the proof load. And guys, this isn't your standard ammunition. This load is specifically engineered to exceed normal service pressure by an extreme 30%. 30%! Finally, there's the post-firing inspection. If the metal stretches, bulges, or fails in any material way under that massive overpressure, the firearm fails proof and goes to the scrap heap. It is a completely unforgiving system built entirely around withstanding extreme physical realities.
But right here is where our mechanical journey takes a massive, totally fascinating pivot. We've been talking all about controlling extreme lethal pressure, right? Now, ask yourself this. How do engineers safely simulate that exact highly pressurized reality without using real bullets and do it in a country with incredibly tight weapons restrictions? Enter the Japanese model gun. Emerging shortly after the Second World War, these model guns are replicas that look, field strip, and operate internally almost exactly like the real thing. But by very strict design, they are entirely incapable of firing a projectile.
To really understand the model gun, we have to look at the law not as a roadblock, but as a pure engineering constraint. Over the decades, Japanese authorities continuously tightened regulations to make sure these replicas couldn't possibly be converted into actual weapons. In 1965, the law mandated an internal barrel insert. By 1971, things got stricter. If a model gun was metal, the barrel had to be completely blocked off and the whole gun painted white or yellow so nobody could mistake it for a real weapon. And then, in 1977, they banned the use of hard metals entirely for main components, forcing manufacturers to use soft zinc alloys instead. But here's the incredible part. Every single time the law changed to guarantee total non-lethality, the engineers just went back to the drawing board and completely reinvented the mechanics to keep the simulation alive.
Case in point, when that 1977 law prohibited hard metals, manufacturers knew they couldn't just pivot to producing cheap-feeling, lightweight plastic toys. Their customers absolutely demanded the tactile reality, the heft of real steel. So the engineers brilliantly innovated a brand new material called heavyweight, or HW plastic. By mixing ABS resin with fine metal powders, like zinc or iron, they created something that was perfectly legal and structurally incapable of withstanding the pressure of a real bullet, but actually felt surprisingly cold and incredibly heavy in your hand. They kept the tactile illusion totally intact while strictly following the safety laws, a real game changer.
This constraint sparked about 3 decades of just relentless innovation, a lot of it spearheaded by a legendary designer named Tanio Kobayashi. Let's trace how this builds. In the 1950s, the industry kicked off with pretty crude imported cap guns from America, but by 1962, Kobayashi's company, MGC, introduced a true slide-action model. Then, in 1968, they hit a massive breakthrough: cap blowback technology. They actually used the tiny microscopic explosion of a toy cap to force the heavy slide backwards. And finally, in 1980, this whole evolution culminated in the invention of the plug-fire cartridge, which completely elevated these toys into hyper-realistic mechanical replicas.
To really appreciate the genius here, let's deconstruct the mechanics for a second. Early blowback models relied on a side-fire system. Because of strict safety limits, they obviously couldn't use a real firing pin. So instead, a stamped steel block would strike the outer rim of the cartridge to ignite a paper cap. Kind of a clunky workaround. But as the engineering evolved, they developed the center fire system, and this is ultra-realistic. It perfectly mimics a real gun. A specialized, safe firing pin actually strikes the direct center of a simulated primer on the cartridge, pushing the cap precisely into a detonator located securely inside the blocked barrel. Now, let's look at these two extremes side by side, because this brilliantly illustrates the whole journey. On one hand, we have the destructive British proof loads we explored earlier. These are tests generating 30% overpressure to make absolutely sure thick steel doesn't shatter. On the other hand, we have these plug-fire cartridges, or PFCs. These are ingenious multi-piece brass mechanisms that look exactly like real bullets. But they use a tiny 5 or 7 millimeter plastic cap and an internal piston to perfectly capture and direct an absolute minimum amount of gas. So one system uses immense, violent pressure to prove a weapon, while the other uses microscopic pressure to safely mimic one.
And the result of this intense Japanese engineering constraint? Well, it's what we can fairly call the perfect simulation. Without a single lethal projectile, and using materials that are specifically legally mandated to be weak and safe, they managed to achieve the exact tactile, auditory, and visual feedback of a real firearm. When you pull the trigger, you get the whole shebang. The visual sparks and smoke, the loud audible bang, the physical blowback of the slide cycling a real brass casing through the air. You can even field strip it just like the real thing. It is absolutely a triumph of mechanical engineering.
Which leaves us with a rather profound paradox today. We started by looking at the sheer dangerous power of a real shotgun and the incredibly strict laws required to keep it from literally exploding in our hands. And we ended up with a harmless replica, engineered so precisely that it perfectly mimics that exact danger without any of the actual risk. So, I'll leave you with this question. When we completely strip away the lethality and replicate the mechanics of danger this perfectly, are we just celebrating the weapon itself, or are we truly mastering the fascinating engineering behind it? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning how the things around you are built.